Uh-huh. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing about the immigrations to Peru. This is the third part of a series of lectures we have dedicated to the immigrations. And in this chapter, we are going to be talking about the European immigrations. We originally wanted to focus in the 19th century, but we thought we wouldn't be making justice to the actual history of Europeans in Peru. So we have divided this lecture today in basically 4 parts. 2 of them are going to be conducted by me and 2 of them will be conducted by Marek. So I'm going to start with the Italian immigration and French immigration, and Marek?
I will talk about the British and the German immigration to Peru.
Okay, so let's start sharing the slides. And the reason why I'm starting with the Italian immigration is because this one is known as the biggest immigration we had to Peru from Europe, and also the one that is more symbolic, most rooted. And well, we definitely have to talk about, first of all, the origin of sorry, I'm going to go backwards. Okay. So we have to talk about the origin of the Italian immigration. So basically, to talk about the immigrations from Europe, it's necessary to go back to the colonial era, because most of these immigrations started a long time ago. It started in the 16th century. But being very honest, back in the colonial times, the Spanish crown was very jealous with its colonies in the New World. So they were creating blockage or forms of protections because they didn't want any others from Europe to come here and compete with them. And also another important thing is that in Europe, well, there were new religions emerging that were not Catholic, and the Spaniards were very protective about the religion they were teaching to the indigenous. So during the colonial times, we have, first of all, 2 important moments of our history that were also reason for a small group of Italians to come initially during these times to Peru. First of all, the conquest of the Tahuantinsuyo, and we know that some Italians were here during that period of time. Also, some of them were supporters of Pizarro, or the Pizarro brothers, basically, and the resistance of the Pizarros against the, let's say, the coming of the viceroys and taking their possessions and their wealth away from them. So we know that there is a presence of Italians here, very small, actually, 3 Italians during that time. And also something important is that in the Spanish kingdom, there were also celebrated some connections or relations between the Spanish kings, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Republic of Genoa. So even so tight were these relations that we had also a Italian viceroy. So we will talk a little bit about this person ahead. So just some numbers here for you. Well, basically between the year 1532 to 1560, we have officially 50 Italians here in this territory. Not a very big number. And as you can see, it continues until the 17th century, very small number, over 300 Italians. You can notice also that most of these Italians were from Genova. So the biggest number even continue until the 19th century of Genoveses or Genovese. So this is important to be taken in consideration. So as you can notice also, well, this is the map of Italy. Most of the Italians who were here in this territory, in this territory, originally came from the zone of Liguria. That's the northernmost part of the map, close to the Mediterranean Sea. So Liguria. So that's the zone where most of these Italians came originally, especially in this period of our history. And the locations where they finally ended up here in Peru were Lima and in most of the cases Trujillo in the north of the country, because both were the most developed zones. So, for example, here we have a picture of the only viceroy that was Italian. And you can see that this is a very early time in the history of Peru. It's the 18th century, so Carmineo Nicolás Caracciolo. And also talking about the occupations of the Italians, most of them were sailors or soldiers. And as you know, well, Spain had a good relation with some, say, independent governments there in what nowadays is Italy. So there was also a positive relation of reciprocity between Spain and those territories. So that's why there were some sailors and some soldiers here in these territories. Merchants also, lots of clergymen. Catholicism was a very important thing for Spaniards. So that was one of the forms for foreigners to finally come over here. If you were not Catholic, if you were not in some form servant of the Spanish crown, you will not be permitted into these territories. And also artists. There were many artists that were here in America, in the New World, that were not Spanish, and especially Italians. The Renaissance art was highly valuated by the Spanish viceroys and here in the New World. So there were several of them invited by the crown to work in the construction of several churches in Lima, in Cusco especially, because these both cities were very rich, and well, the religious orders were able to pay lots of art. They had lots of money, but not just the religious orders. I mean, indirectly, there were many rich people of that time that were rich because of the gold and the silver of the Incas, that were very eager to pay their way to heaven by indulgences or by buying art. But also, well, the art was a way for the indigenous to be persuaded into the new faith. So here I have some images corresponding to, let's say, some of the most important people, Italian men, that were here in Peru during that colonial era, during the viceroyalty times. We have, for example, Bernardo Vitti, and Bernardo Vitti is known as one of the most important Italian artists we had in Peru. He produced lots of paintings. He actually, the style of his painting is known as manieristic. This is also one of the currents, artistic currents, that was in vogue in Italy for long. And Mateo Perez de Alessio is another famous, this time Renaissance artist. He painted lots of virgins, representations of Jesuses. As you can see here, this is one of his most famous painting. And this is the mother with the child, the Jesus Christ, but this is also known as the mother of the milk, because she's offering milk to baby Jesus. A very controversial painting, by the way, for that time. And we have Antonio Riccardi, very important person, because he was the first one who started to press books here in Lima. Now we're talking about the year 1583, when the first book, which was actually a liturgic book, was printed in the city of Lima. Another Italian, no? And finally, Andrea or Andrew Bolognesi. This person was a musician, but you can see that right next to the musician, we have another picture, the picture of his son, Francisco Bolognesi, or Bolognesi. He is one of the most important Peruvian heroes. He is the patron of the Peruvian military, and he's also known as one of the most important heroes during the defense of the Peruvian territory in the times of the Chilean invasion. We're talking about, well, the War of the Pacific, basically. So during the Republican times, we have a huge number of Italians arriving to Peru. As you know already, most of them were Ligurians, no? They were from the north part of Italy. And the reasons of the arrival of these many people were, first of all, well, the independence from Spain. No? Peru was now a free country. We had the borders open for anyone that wanted to make a business here or to come. And also there were many people looking for opportunities outside Europe back then. No? So Peru was not as inhabited as it used to be. So it was pretty much a virgin land. So people were looking for opportunities. But the reason of the boom, the explosion of the immigration towards Peru specifically was the guano boom. Oh, the guano, the fertilizer, the bird poop, no? That is also very famous and famous as the most effective and natural let's say fertilizer, no, that exists. This was the reason of a fast bonanza we had here in Peru during the period of, first of all, the early discovery of the guano. It was the 1830s, 1840s, 50s, 60s, and then in the 70s, unfortunately, everything was stopped by the war with Chile, also known as the War of the Pacific, as you can notice here in this list. So during the times of the arrival of the Italians, most of them were originally not rich people. Many of them were coming with all their savings. Of course, there's always a large group of immigrants that are, well, let's say not qualified. They are just workers, manual workers, construction workers. And there is a small group always of well-off, educated people. So let's focus in the bigger group. No? So most of these businessmen that started from zero, they were able to save money over the years, especially the ones that came during the guano boom. They were able to rapidly see their businesses grow. No? So most of the Italians that were here in Lima during the 19th century, mid-19th century especially, started to open stores that had everything, like little supermarkets. But back in that time, in the Republican times, those little markets were called pulperias. Well, you had everything in the pulperias. Also, many of these Italians were known as chinganeros. What is a chingana? Chingana is a bar. No, it's a bar where you can drink a hard liquor, you can drink pisco. So very important to notice that. And also, well, the Italians are very well recognized as viñateros, which means producers of grapes, and also producers of wine. So this is also very important for both cases. The Italians have very, very big reputations. Fondero, a fonda was a restaurant. And artisans, well, of course, in general, people that were able to, from sewing clothes, making boots, making hats, etc. So during the times of the Republica, we have also two famous Italians that were here in these territories for, let's say, actually the same reasons they ended up here. Both of them Italians, they were fighting for the unification of Italy. And initially, the first fights for the unification were not fruitful. So here we have the picture of Giuseppe Garibaldi, one of the greatest heroes of the unification of Italy. You might be very surprised when I will be telling you that Giuseppe Garibaldi had to nationalize Peruvian, and he did actually when he came to Peru, but not because he really wanted to be Peruvian, by the way, because eventually he returned to Italy and he fought for the unification of Italy and he made it possible. So he's a big figure of Italy. But the reason why he nationalized is because during the times he was here, during the 60s of the 19th century, he wanted to get into the business of the guano. And nobody that was not Peruvian or nationalized Peruvian could put their hands in such business. So that's why he did it, but he just used this nationality for about a year, and then he returned to his nation. He never returned again to Peru. He actually lived very, very close to the main square of Lima. And the other personality, much more known in Peru, there are so many schools named after him, Antonio Raimondi. He is he was a botanic, a scientist, a man of science, a man of nature. And for example, well, we have one specimen called Puya Raimondi, which is a flower that huge, actually looks like a tree, but it's a flower that is very, very special, very unique, and has the name Puya Raimondi because he was the person who studied. So Raimondi was the only person of his time that lived in Peru that considered important to protect and to know the Peruvian fauna, the Peruvian flora. He was the only specialist of his time that tried to preserve that flora, that fauna, and especially try to understand it. So that's why he's so important for Peru, this Italian man. And the Italian population in the 19th century, well, you can see some numbers here. In the year 1857, only over 3,000 Italians. Look at the explosion of Italians because of the guano boom. In the year 1876, we have over 10,000 Italians. So this is huge, but unfortunately the census, they vary a lot. We don't have very clear information about how many really came. Maybe they were more, or maybe some numbers were inflated, were exaggerated. But this is the information we can have in most of the history books and online sources. Also, the population of the city of Lima back in the year 1858 was just 95,000 people. And we know that foreigners in Lima City back then in the same time, there were about 22,000. So we had a huge number of foreigners living in this city. And from this big group, Italians were about 5,000. So we're talking about just Lima. And important to see that the same amount of Italians, we had Germans also. Both were back in that time in the 1850s, the biggest groups of foreigners here. And why we are not referring about the Chinese? Do you remember the Chinese? We were talking about the Chinese in another lecture. Well, because most of these Chinese were not in Lima. Most of them were in the haciendas, were working, picking up the guano. So they were not in the city, they were outside the city. The organizations attributed to the Italians during this period are, for example, the Italian Beneficence, the Italian Hospital, one of the best schools of that time, the Santa Margaret School, and the Italian Bank, which nowadays is one of the biggest and most solid institutions of Peru, the Banco de Crédito del Perú, which was established by Italians. And also firefighter companies. This is not something exclusive to the Italians. Also, the French created firefighter companies. In the contemporary time, we have also another important part of the history of the Italians and the history of the immigrants here in this nation. The Second World War was a very important marking point for many of them, determinant for many in Europe to emigrate to America, and also another breaking point for Europeans to return to their nations in some cases was, for example, the terrorism in Peru that started in the 1970s, became very, very bad during the 80s and early 90s. So here's some numbers about the population in the year 1910. We have an estimated of 175,000 Italians here in Peru. and an increment of them after Second World War until this huge number, no, 610,000 of them in this territory. But we don't know exactly how many left, but we know that many left during the time of the terrorism, around the 80s. And something important is in 2007, we have the information that in Peru, there are about 26,000 Italians living with an Italian passport. But it could be also people with double nationality, by the way. So it's not even sometimes people that have ever lived in Italy, they might have a double nationality. We have also another number from 2015 that about 2 million or almost 3 million people in Peru are descendants of Italians. Look how much they have proliferated in the country. So this is very, very important. Some important buildings also related with the Italian community, especially the one in the upper side, left side, we have the Italian Museum. The Italian Museum was a gift from the Italian community to Peru for the celebration of the independence of this nation in the year, 100 years independence in the year 1921. And actually most of the expenses to buy this museum came from the owner of the Italian bank, which nowadays is the famous Banco de Crédito del Perú. We have also a picture next of the Raimondi School, where the preparation is not just in the European standards, also the first language children learn there is Italian, and they use Italian in all the courses, in all the classes. The Círculo Sportivo Italiano is a club that has many, many years, and they are very supported with let's say forming athletes, and especially the ones that are more like inclined to football. So it's a really good club for Italian descendants also. And we have here a little picture of the town of Chacas. This is a town that it's still nowadays populated by hundreds of Italians, no, that came to teach the native people about the art of carving wood. By the way, where is Chacas, Mari? Do you remember where is exactly?
In Ancash.
Ancash.
400 kilometers northeast from Lima.
Thank you so much. And by the way, one detail is that the style of the constructions is Lombardon style, which is one of the styles typical from Italy. Well, to finish about the Italians, we have to talk about the food and the influences of the Italians in the cuisine. And let me also tell you that, for example, in the upper part, we have the tallarines verdes with that beautiful bistec on top, the green spaghetti, and right next, the dish that gave origin to this one, the spaghetti al pesto. In our style, we use spinach. So this is a really interesting local twist. We have the panettone in the lower side. The Pascualina cake here in Peru is called pastel de acelgas. It's one of the most delicious cakes we have. It's a salty one. In the lower part also, we have two soups. We have the minestrone, which is the original one, the Italian, the one with the spoon necks. And we have the Peruvian menestrone, the other side, that is, well, let's say a much more contundent, very, very heavy recipe that we love. And it actually is a variant of the minestrone. And also on the other extreme, we have the quinoto. So the quinoto is the local version of the risotto, the Italian risotto. So, and well, I will finish this part also for asking you, well, some of your questions. So in that way, we can pass to Marek. So the French immigration to Peru is also very important, because the French immigration is known as the third most important, most numerous in the country. Most of the French people whom arrived to this territory were from the zones of the Atlantic coast, and especially between the zones of Gironda and the Atlantic Pyrenees, which are in the south part, as you can see, looking to the Atlantic Ocean. So we have also from other locations, indeed, but also very important to notice that some of them came from the zone of Paris, but it was not the biggest number, actually. During the colonial times, we have a couple of reasons why the Frenchmen came to Peru. Some of them were Protestants, and we know that the Inquisition was chasing them for long. There is a very famous case of a man, Mateo Salado, or Matthew Saladé, which we're going to be talking a little while, but we know from the Inquisition documents that some French were accused of heresy, and were persecuted also for that reason. And also another reason for the Frenchmen to come to this territory was the smuggling and the piracy. Most of the French pirates were not coming to Peru, honestly. Most of them were going to the Caribbean. So the ones that ventured into this direction were mainly British. But we know that many French men started to work in this illicit job of smuggling, because the problem is that Spain was very jealous of its colonies, right? And it was beneficial for them to be the only ones to have a monopoly of trade of products. So everything was very expensive. The Peruvian people had to pay huge prices for goods from Europe. So the French people started to smuggling products from Europe and selling them very cheap. So that was a really good business for many of them. Actually, you can see here, well, some paintings, pictures about the smuggling of products from the French, and also again the name Mateo Salado. So Mateo Salado was a Frenchman who was here in this territory in the mid 16th century, and unfortunately for him, he was trapped by the Inquisition and accused of being an heretic. He was killed in the main square of Lima in the year 1573. In the case of the French ships that I was mentioning about the smuggling problem, during the times of the colonial era, there were discovered or found officially over 100 ships, French ships in this coast, in these territories, between the period of the year 1698 and 1724. During the Republican times, we have reasons for the Frenchmen to come to Peru. And first of all, was the expulsion of the Spaniards. And the Spaniards, once they were expelled during the independence, there were many businesses that were left with no owners, or many like holes, let's say, in the chain of production. So the French came to occupy, and many of the foreigner Europeans, of course, came to occupy those empty spaces, right? Also, well, it's well known that the liberators were very inclined to admire anything that was French. So that's why these French businesses started to flourish. The French cuisine started to flourish back in the independence times. Also, we have, well, the guano boom, the Dreyfus contract, and the luxury businesses. So everything was connected at some point. You know, the guano boom started to make rich many people, right? And many of these rich people started to need luxurious items from Europe. So that's why many French people started to be in the business of luxury like products. It's like clothing, for example, jewelry, wigs, like things like that. And also luxurious things for the houses of these rich people. And embracing the French culture, yes, because the new fashion, you know, French fashion, French cuisine. So we were fascinated in Peru about everything French. The War of the Pacific was the reason for the ending of this big influx of French. The independence times, of course, a time of changes, a time when the French style came, not just in the, you know, in the food or the fashion, even the ideals, because many of these liberators like Bolivar or San Martin were followers of the footsteps of Napoleon, for example. We have the Dreyfus contract. This is also known as the first biggest scandal of Peru as a nation. And well, just to make a long story short, Auguste Dreyfus, which was a representative of the Dreyfus Company, won a contract in which the Dreyfus House will have the monopoly for selling the guano to Europe. And of course, the company will be giving something back to the country besides paying, of course, for everything, the guano exported. Also, they will be paying the foreign debt of Peru. But eventually the contract was canceled because just 6 years after it was officially put on, the government noticed that this company, and especially Auguste Dreyfus, stole to Peru about 360,000 tons of guano. So they were selling guano, but also they were selling additional to what they were officially saying guano, and they were pocketing this money, not directly. So the biggest and the first and biggest scandal. We have also, not all of the French were that mean. We have also two very, very famous Frenchmen that I will share with you. Eugene Couriet is known as the first photographer we had in Peru. Here you can see his photographies with his family and also himself. And he's also very famous because in the downtown of Lima, we have the Couriet studio still nowadays. Unfortunately, well, none of the family stay here after the war with Chile and economical decadence we had in Peru. They decided that their businesses here were over, so they returned to France. And finally, about important personalities of that time, we have the Admiral du Petitoires, one of the most celebrated foreigners during the time of the war with Chile, our protector, the protector of Lima. This man protected the city from the Chilean invasion. When Baquedano general, the Chilean general, was about to burn the downtown Lima after burning Barranco, after burning Chorrillos, he wanted to destroy everything. This French admiral, he standed in front of him and he said that if he put his hand in downtown Lima, he will have a direct problem with France and he will attack the Chilean ships that were in the coast of Callao. So, well, Baquedano saw that, well, him and also other group of international admirals, which were protecting the city, they were talking very seriously. He decided not to touch downtown Lima, and that's how nowadays we still have our city in the way you see it. That's why we have in the downtown a monument dedicated to him. You can see that lady standing next to him. She is the nation thanking Admiral du Petitoires. Occupations, well, depending, of course, most of the Frenchmen who came to Peru were miners, sailors, artisans, or bakers, but the important ones, which were very, very tiny, were scientifics, studies, administrators, artists, engineers, photographers, and architects. I mean, everyone was important, but people that directly impacted the country's history were this other group. The censuses say that in the year 1825, we had 300 Frenchmen only, and ending the 19th century, a huge number, 15,000 of them. Some of the important contemporary buildings of them, we have the Plaza Francia on one side, the one that is next to the blue church. It was a gift from the French community to Peru during the celebrations of the 100 years of independence of Peru. And we have the French Palace, which is also a very important symbol of the French style in this nation. But nobody knows about those buildings. Peruvians know about the baguette, and they know about the pan francés, or the French bread, which are possibly the most important additions to the everyday life of local people. We have also some few personalities. This is the last slideshow. We have personalities that are descendants of French. Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was, besides also descendant of Polish, descendant of French. Another person, politician, we have Ricardo Belmont. We have also a lady running to become president, Veronica Mendoza. Her mom was French. She has double nationality. Also, Mr. Mañer in the lower part, he's a saxophonist, famous Peruvian saxophonist. Less known, but also very important, Carlos Doñi Larco, the person that is surfing with the lady in his shoulder. He introduced the Hawaiian board to Peru. He was a dandy, of his days. And well, in the more religious side, we have Mr. Cipriani, Archbishop Cipriani Thorn, which also has or is descendant of French. So nowadays, we know that it's estimated that about 930,000 Peruvians are French descendants.
Okay, so let's start with the British immigration to Peru. Okay, the first contact with Peru and the British islands were not peaceful. The first contact were with the pirates. The British cannot live in the American colonies for two reasons: because all the time they have conflicts with Spaniards, and the second, they were Anglicans. They were not Catholics, so they cannot live in this land. But they, of course, as you know, they were pirates, corsairs. They attacked the ships from Spain. They sacked the ports, and here in Peru was not the exception. So we have two attacks from pirates during the 16th century. The most famous pirate that attacked Lima, specifically Callao, the port, because they never reached Lima, was Francis Drake in 1579. And he even was captured and spent 2 years in prison in Lima. And the other was Thomas Candish, who attacked Callao in 1587. Callao and also Paita in the north of Peru. Okay. We also had one viceroy, but he was not English indeed. He was Irish, because the Irish were Catholics. So he was first governor of Chile between 1788 and 1796, and viceroy of Peru between 1796 and 1801. He was Catholic, and he was the viceroy of Peru, governor in Chile, and during his time of Chile, he had a son with a Chilean woman, Bernardo O'Higgins, one of the heroes of the liberation wars in South America, actually, who was the first president of Chile, and he also fought in Peru with the trophies of the general Don José de San Martín, and he dies in Lima. Also, in these times, in these wars, came a lot of militaries from England. England had, you know, in those times, the process of liberation in Latin America starts when Napoleon occupies Spain. So the King of Spain was captive, and it starts the process of liberation of the South American countries. And then the English also fight against the Spaniards, to expel the French, and they extend the war to South America. And the first English military entered with General Don José de San Martín. They fought in the liberation of Argentina, then in Chile, and most of them belong to the Navy. So they come through the ocean to Peru and fight here. The first one is Lord Cochrane. He came back to England, but the other one also stay here. In the Middle East, Martin Guise, who was the founder of the of the Peruvian Navy, and Guillermo or William Miller. William Miller was very active and was one of the commandants in the Battle of Ayacucho. Now, both of them remain here in Peru and establish families. Also, it's very important to know that the first diplomatic representations from Peru that the first diplomats that Peru sent to the war, there were Englishmen. The Englishmen were the first ambassadors of the new republic. And a lot of days remains after the independence war. 3 years after San Martin getting to Peru came Bolivar, and Bolivar reports that 300 English men were living in Lima. In the middle of the 19th century, a little bit later, so came the naturalists from Europe to explore the new world, as Antonio Raimondi, the Italian, and also came one very important man from England, Sir Clements Markham. Clements Markham lived here and explored Peru between 1852 and 1860. Then they came back to England and write a lot of books regarding his experience here in Peru on those times. And he also was a very active defender in the media for the Peruvian situation on the war against Chile. He always was a defender of the Peruvian position on the English politics, because he wrote in journals, and he was also the president of the Royal Society at the end of his life in the end of the century. A very important man. But the history is very sad. We are not so grateful with those British men because they were not Catholics. They were not allowed to have to be buried together with Catholics. So they established their own cemetery starting in 1835 in the port of Callao. And actually, this was a cemetery not just for English, also for example, Germans and the people the Europeans that were not Catholic. So this cemetery get full in 1955, and we open a second one also in Callao. But since 1955, everyone can be buried in this new cemetery. It's very important that no other religion were allowed in Peru until the Constitution of 1920. So for another 100 years after we get the independence, so in our Constitution wrote that the only church in Peru is the Catholic Church. So the people that were not Catholic used to have another cemeteries. And this cemetery, the oldest one, is a memorial site. There are very important English that fight in the wars of independence that they are burying here. Then we have, of course, the conflict with Chile, the War of the Pacific. This time in Lima lives around 5,000 British men, and a lot of them fight for Peru during this war. They put on their houses the flags of Britain, and the people who can escape and get into the houses, they were not touched because the Chileans were not, they don't have the balls to attack the British houses. Then later, after we finished the war, in the year 1888, so Peru, as you know, we lost the war, so we were broke. We have a very big external debt. So we made a contract. We made a contract with the British government called the Grace contract. It's not the British government, it was a private company, Grace, and they compromised to pay all our external debt. And of course, instead of that, they receive, for example, the control or the monopoly of the railways and the use of the ports. So in that time, many English men, especially engineers or workers, work in the restoration of the railways because the railways were also damaged during the war, and also in rebuilding the Navy of Peru. So a lot of engineers and technicians came in the end of the 19th century. And also, as you know, came technicians and also a lot of sailors because there were a lot of exchange of goods between England and Peru, and they bring sports. They bring sport, they bring, for example, golf, cricket, tennis, but the most important is a very important part of the South American culture is the football. In 1921, there were different presence of the different colonies, as Vanessa says, the church in Plaza Francia, the Museo Italiano, and the British give us our first stadium for soccer. No, it was for 6,000 people, and the clubs the first clubs of football, of course, they were also founded by English. They start to compete in this stadium, no? And this stadium, the same stadium, the same place, nowadays is our national stadium for 55,000 people, no? Where the national representation of Peru plays. Also, they have a lot of influence in culture, and in 1937, it was established the Centro Cultural Peruano Británico, no? Centro Cultural is important because they promote the culture of the British community in Peru. Now, of course, the school is a big school of English, the best one in Peru, and they also promote, they have library, they have theater, they promote arts and literature too. And we have another important influence of the British. Maybe nobody knows here in Peru, but our national beverage, Inca Cola, was created in 1935 by the son of an Englishman, Isaac Lindley. Lindley is the last name of the creator of the formula of the Inca Cola, no? Our national beverage. So we have two very important things related with our culture, Peruvian culture related with British, no? The football and the Inca Cola. We have important, of course, personalities related with England. One president even is Guillermo Billinghurst. He's a grandson of an Englishman, and he was the president of Peru between 1912 and 1914. Now, the most important things he made during his presidency was give the workers the right of 8 hours work. And nowadays, the mayor of Lima, and Muñoz, what's the name of Muñoz?
Ay, no me acuerdo. Francisco?
No.
No.
José?
No.
Okay, the mayor of Lima is Muñoz Wells, so he's also a descendant of English. And nowadays, we consider that the immigrant descendants of the immigration or the Peruvians with British ascendants is around 100,000 people. So it's a very important influence in our culture or in our history. They were very important because they fought for us in our wars. So we're very thankful to the British. And the other important migration was the German migration. What we can say about the Germans? No, the same as in the case of British, they cannot live don't live in Peru inland. Some of them, yes, if they were Catholics. But remember that Germany is not exist as a country until 1871. So there were many little countries with a principate that speak the same language, but some of them were, for example, Protestants, some of them were Catholics. The Catholic one came, for example, as a priest or missionaries in Peru, but of course they don't leave families here. The first important German that came to Peru was a scientist, Alexander von Humboldt. He's a very important man in the natural science in the world. He spent almost 5 years traveling in South America between Venezuela and Peru. Actually, Peru was the last part of his travel. He spent in Peru just 4 months in 1802. But he made 2 very important discoveries in such little amount of time. First of all, he described and showed to the world and explained the effects of the cold current from the Antarctica. That's why that current has the name of Humboldt current. And the other one, he also discovered or rediscovered the properties of the guano. Because the guano was used by pre-Columbian societies, but the Spaniards stopped to use, they never used the guano. That's why we accumulate a lot of guano in the island. And Humboldt report the first scientific report of the properties of guano. As I told you, there were many different little countries or an independent politician entities in the land that nowadays is Germany, Austria. And the first one that we have diplomatical relation was the port of Hamburg. Hamburg established a consulate in Peru in 1828. And Germans started to came mainly for business. But not only for business. It's a very interesting history regarding the Germans. After we abolished the slavery, of course, we import Chinese workers, but also the country was interested in importing workers from Europe and to colonize the lands of the jungle. And they invitate Germans. And there are 304 Germans accept the invitation to came to Peru to settle themselves in the jungle. Each family, every married man should receive 25 hectares of land, and single men or single persons 12 hectares. So they come with a lot of dreams here to Peru in a very long travel that almost take 4 months because there were no Panama Channel. There was one of the last travels, intercontinental travels made with no steam ships, just the other ones with the, how you call the steams that go with the wind?
Like clippers type, like yes.
Clippers, more than less. No, it takes for them 4 months to go through the channel, Cape Horn, and then reach the port of Huacho. It's like 100 kilometers north of Lima, and from then they start to walk, around 4 months more to get into the jungle, crossing the Cordilleras, that an altitude that over 5,000 meter high. They were not prepared for them. A lot of them died. The ones that were, for example, single, a lot of them escapes and move to Huacho, to Lima, to Callao. And finally, 100 and exactly have the number here, 157 reach the colony of Posuso. Most of them as a families, and they establish there, and they start to fight against the jungle. They don't receive any help from the government. They receive help from other Germans that live in Lima in the form of cows and bulls. So they cattle, the 300 heads of cows and bulls, and they start to live of that, and also they start to plant the land. They produce rice, yucca, cacao, so this what were the plantations that those Germans made, and they established a colony. This is a picture of the 19th century. They established their colony. They built the houses on wood. They built their own church. So now all those houses, some of them are remaining there, and there are museums of the German immigration because they survived this migration. A very important thing that was the Peruvian government demand that those Germans should be Catholics. No, we are still we were still living in the Middle Age, yes, in the middle of the 19th century. The government demands that they should be Catholics, so they came mainly from Tyrol and Bavaria. So the Catholic parts of German lands. I look at these pictures. It seems like Austria. But it's not Austria, it's the Peruvian jungle. They built in the German style. Okay. During those times, also in the coast of Peru, it was the boom of the guano. They suffer in the jungle, but the ones that live in the Lima and the cities of the coast improve their ways of life. They create companies that import products of Europe, the Haus Gildemeister, and the amount of Germans, of course, increase. They create many businesses, and another important business they create here is this one. Okay, maybe this building don't speak too much, but this will speak very well. The first brewery in Peru was established in the port of Callao, but a German man, his name was Federico Bindels, in 1863. Is the oldest brewery in Peru, and still produce this beer that is very popular, Pilsen, is the kind of beer that he produced, and he also named the product the same way, in the port of Callao. Finishing the 19th century, we also are moving. We're talking about 5,000 Germans that were living mainly in Lima, but they not stay in Lima all the time. Another important institution they create in 1863 was the Club Germania. When they meet, there was a point when they meet each other, they drink beers, they have also the religious celebration because they were not allowed until 1920. They have their Lutheran celebrations or Protestant celebration in the Club Germania. That club exists until nowadays. It's one of the oldest in the country. And the Germans don't stay here in Lima, they move a lot. Also, more or less later after the war with Chile, came Ernest Middendorf. Ernest Middendorf is the grandfather of the Peruvian archaeology. He also travels a lot in the south of Peru and made the first sketches and the first theories of the development of the Peruvian societies. And he wrote even a book, a very nice book that has many editations, Observaciones y Estudios, Observation and Study of the Country and His Inhabitants. Another very important, maybe the most important, is Max Uhle. Max Uhle, if Middendorf is the grandfather, Max Uhle is the father of the Peruvian archaeology. He studied many, many places, and the most important place he studied was Pachacamac, in the south of Lima. He was the first archaeology that used the stratigraphic method in South America. That means make excavation in layers. And he made in 1903 a very nice map of the site of Pachacamac that is still considered the most exactly one of Pachacamac. It's from 1903 and is still used by archaeologists. And later, aerial photographs show that the map is perfect. This point, no, I don't have the, yes. Okay, but the map is perfect. Look at the aerial photograph and the sketch. Another important German was Heinrich Brüning. He lives in the north of Peru between 1860 and 1880, and he studies the language of the society Mochica. It's a language called Muchic. Nowadays, this language is extinct, but he makes records of that language. Are the only record of those languages that exist nowadays. And he also a big collection, of course, of pieces of pottery, of pieces of metal. And in 1962, it was established with the things that he had, a museum archaeológico Brüning that is in the city of Chiclayo. It's a very important museum. And another important German person is Maria Reich. Maria Reich, a German mathematician that studied almost 40 years the line of Nazca in the desert, and she creates and supports the theory that it was a very big solar and astronomical calendar. Nowadays, this theory is not more actual, but thanks her efforts, the Nazca lines were famous on the world and were considered human heritage recognized by UNESCO in 1994. She died in 1998, spending more than 40 years of her life taking care and studying the lines. And during our celebration of our first century, of course, the German colony also gave us a present. What the best present for German than a clock? Maybe you want to say that we are always delayed. Yeah? So that's the biggest clock in Lima. It's 30-meter high. And this is the present of the German communities located in front of the rector or Collegium Mayos of the University of San Marcos in the downtown of Lima. Of course, the Second World War was also a very important fact in the history that also affects the relations with the Germans in Peru, because Peru was part of the alliance, and as well as Vanessa explained about how they destroyed the properties of the Japanese, there were also deportations on Germans. So more than 300 Germans were deported, no, mainly to United States. And then in United States, they were exchanged for prisoners. And of course, the properties of those Germans were expropriated. But in the other side, there were association of Jewish that take care of the Jewish that came from Germany during the 30s. So a lot of Jewish came to Peru before the war explodes, in the 30s, between 33 and 39. More than 380 Jewish came at that time. The most important of them was Theo Buchwald, who was an Austrian in that time. And Theo Buchwald was a musician. And Theo Buchwald bring a lot of musicians, Jewish musicians, from German lands to Peru, and they established in 1938 the National Symphonic of Peru. That was founded by German Jewish. Also, you have schools that learn German. 6 schools teach Germans in Peru. 5 of them are in Lima, 1 in Arequipa. And also we have the Goethe Institute, that, as well as the Británico, is the institution that promotes the German culture in the world. So we have the Goethe Institute in Lima that, of course, they teach German and also spread the German culture. And according to statistics, nowadays we have around 200,000 German descendants in Peru. So that's the presentation I prepare for you.
So, well, thank you so much for your participation. It's been much longer than regular, this exposition, but we really hope you love it. So, muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We love you. Thank you.
Congratulations.
No.
Gracias.
Gracias. Gracias.
Chao, chao.